Okay, very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show, Dennis Miller, who is the guy you might know from Miller on the Money. In fact, I learned about him by reading his Market Watch article, a recent one called How Investing Retirement Money is Different. Dennis, how is investing retirement money different?
Well, that's an interesting question because what's happened is we work through our life and then we get to the point that we retire. And, you know, we've always used to joke about the fact I'm no longer trying to get rich. I'm just trying to avoid getting poor. But that actually describes it. If I were to use a quick analogy, those who have invested money in some of the 529 programs and the other programs that you use for children and grandchildren's college, in the early days, you want to get these spectacular gains where you can build up a nest egg and you can compound it. But the time that that child starts getting into 8th, 9th, 10th grade, you're no longer interested in taking the risk. You're interested in preserving the capital. And when you expand that over a life, that's exactly the same thing. Baby boomers today are more interested in preservation of capital so that they don't outlive their money. That's a different goal.
Okay, so we're looking at making sure that you don't outlive your money. But the problem is, with interest rates so low today, how are people actually supposed to pay the bills if they can't just put their money in the bank and rely on getting a reasonable rate of interest?
Boy, that's a tough question because an entire generation is faced with the problem. You know, I was talking to some friends recently. Our generation was led to believe you could do just what you suggested, live off the interest and never touch the principal. You know, years ago, I sat down with a professional advisor like yourself, and we ran all the numbers. And, well, you can always get 6% at a CD. Well, you can't anymore.
Oh, wow.
And so I've had actually 2 conversations this week with executives that said, you know, the first time you have to touch the principal, it's terrifying because that's not the way we were brought up. Now, to get to your question, I think what's happening is the government, through their interest rates policies, and this is all over the world, are forcing investors to go from what Benjamin Graham used to call passive investors to becoming active investors, finding those investments, those needles in the haystack that are going to continue to appreciate and throw off capital, but do it safely. And I am one today that I'm really, really pushing that investors need to get professional help. You can't just go buy an S&P 500 fund anymore and expect to meet your goals. It's a challenge, and you need help in order to meet that challenge. And it's getting tougher by the day, as far as I can see.
There are people that claim that at the end of the day, the stock market always outperforms everything else, and that's where you should put your money. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, I have a problem with those who are advocates of what they used to call, and you're very familiar with, buy and hold.
Sure.
You know, come on, hold on. You know, the stock market always comes back. I'll give you a real world example. A member of a group of guys that have breakfast regularly called the Romeo Club, retired old men eating out. And, you know, when the stock market crashed in 2007, some of these guys saw their 401ks drop by as much as 40 to 50%. Now, Douglas, you remember the old rule, you could take out 4% and you'd be okay. Well, they still had their bills to pay. So now instead of taking out 4%, they have to take out 8%. And there's no guarantee that it's going to come back within their lifetime. How many years did it take the market to come back after 1929? So the idea being that you can't just set it and forget it, because while the stock market may come back, there is no guarantee that by the time it gets there, you haven't drained your capital down so far that you're never going to be able to recover. You've got to be much more active.
We're talking with Dennis Miller, who's the guy you know from Miller on the Money. Dennis, I want to dive more into this point you're talking about being an active investor. Now, the Nobel Prize winner Eugene Fama once said that you should look at investments like you look at a bar of soap. The more you touch it, the smaller it gets. You think he's onto something, or you think people really should be active investors?
I think people should be active investors with professional help. I get too many of these newsletters that you get in the mail everywhere. They're bombarding your inbox. Gain 29% in the next 90 days, guaranteed to triple your money over the next 3 years. Okay. That's liquid soap to start with. I think what has to happen is there is no substitute. I work with some very, very good chartered financial analysts. I mean, these guys are like yourself. They're experts. They're going in and digging deep. There are investments out there that you can look at that maybe won't set the world on fire, but we don't have to set the world on fire. We've just got to stay ahead of the game. And what you've got to do is be very, very selective. I think his soap analogy is right. If the investor is not getting proper help and really doing their homework. And one point I might add, you don't go whole hog when you find it. That's another area where you get in trouble. You have to really diversify and limit your risk no matter how good that investment looks.
I like your point about not trying to set the world on fire and instead trying to invest for what you need. I actually recently met with a couple, and they said they were working very, very hard in their own business, and they frankly weren't so happy. They had plenty of money in savings. And so I said, okay, how do you want to invest your savings? They said, let's put it all in the stock market to make it grow. And I said, maybe you're right, that'll happen, but why don't we convert some of that money today to income so that you can improve your lifestyle today and you can afford it, you could manage it. And this was like a revelation to them that they could actually invest based on what their goals were and not just because, like you said, some newsletter comes along and says, you have to invest in X, Y, or Z. I think investing is designed to be much more personal about who you are, and don't just try to, as you said, set the world on fire. So Dennis, let me ask you a question, because I know that you also talk about international investing, and that's a hot topic for people who listen to the Goldstein on Gelt show, because a lot of them live in Israel. They do invest in America or through America, but they do think globally. Do you think that's an important part of a retiree portfolio?
Absolutely, particularly for Americans and those that are invested in euros. You take a look at the negative interest rates now that the European countries have, and you take a look at the U.S. that's printing up trillions and trillions of dollars, and the Japanese are trying to outdo them. There is no guarantee that any single currency in the world is not going to be subjected to higher inflation. And just like you would diversify a portfolio to minimize your risk, you have to diversify your risk in your currency. You can be the greatest investment in the world, investing in Zimbabwe or Venezuela, and end up being broke anyway. A real story. My analyst, the lead analyst, is actually a Russian immigrant, and his mother was saving to buy an apartment, and the ruble kept getting devalued, and her life savings ended up being worth $30.
Oh my gosh.
It's terrifying. You've got to diversify among countries among the world, because your currency risk is just too great when you're trying to preserve your wealth.
Well, I'm really enjoying the pessimistic flavor of our conversation. So let me go into another area that people are kind of afraid of, which we would like them not to be, but I think we really have to touch on it, which is the future of Social Security. Now, when you get your report from Social Security, or I get it, and on the front page it says that in several years, Social Security is not going to have enough money to pay the monthly bills that it has to all of the retirees. Do you think this is something that people should be worried about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I get crosshairs with a lot of financial planners like yourself and your peers, because so many of them are saying it's a no-brainer. Don't take your Social Security to your 72 or 73 because you get 8% return. And, that's putting the risk on the person who's receiving it. And my question to them is, can you guarantee that the government won't change the program in the next 8 years? Can you guarantee I'm going to live the next 8 years? Can you guarantee they're not going to means test it? They're already talking about it in Congress. Social Security is the one annuity that is supposed to be the best in the world, except one issue. The person who is the issuer of the annuity can unilaterally change the contract at will and has a history of doing so. That's a risk.
And not only that, I'll tell you one of the points you raised, which is very important for our U.S. listeners, is that they could make it means tested. So wealthy people, or what the government decides is wealthy, won't get as much as they thought they would get. But I'll tell you one more you can add to that list, which is the U.S. government might very well say that people who no longer live in the United States are not entitled to get all or some of their Social Security. And that's another place that they could cut. And even worse is that once you leave the U.S., if you expatriate and live overseas, you don't have a congressman who you can call and say, hey, stand up for me, because you don't live in anyone's state anymore. Dennis, it's actually fascinating what you're talking about, but unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So tell me, in the last few seconds, how can people follow you and learn more about the work that you're doing?
Well, I read a free blog, milleronthemoney.com, and I do it so I can write about what I feel like. And I'm hoping to build up my readership so I can advertise and keep it free. And I like to look at myself as the advocate for many of the people that you're talking about. I don't have a vested interest in managing their money, and I just am a situation now, like I guess I'm stumbling here, where MarketWatch calls me a retire mentor. Well, that's the peer group I'm in, the people who are living it in the real world every day. And I'm like you are through your radio program. I'm trying to educate them so they understand what's going on so that they can take appropriate steps to protect themselves.
Okay, and it's very valuable. And Dennis, we will put a link to Miller on the Money at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Dennis Miller, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world. If you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.